Terrariums are mainly focused on plants. There's usually no animals. If there are, they're bugs. You wouldn't really keep anything in there but plants. Your Paludariums are semi-aquatic, but there's a little bit more land. The land's more defined. It's drier. And Ripariums, there's not always land in the tank. And later I'll show what I mean by that, but the environments are all slightly different. Terrariums, you can do anything from tropical, woodland, desert, doesn't really matter. Paludariums are usually going to be marshy and kind of humid because they're more closed of a system, so humidity is sometimes a problem. And your Ripariums, a lot of times people that are doing them now are doing them where the top is open, so the plants will grow out, so you're not going to keep things like reptiles in there unless you want reptiles all over your house, which I will admit I've had lizards and frogs and things get out plenty of times. So, like I said, terrariums usually closed or open. It's to display plants. These are what most people are familiar with, and you can make large ones and small ones. I've made some in containers as small as a light bulb, which I actually hollowed out a light bulb and put plants in it, to, I guess my largest was probably like a 55-gallon that I was using to grow aquarium plants. And Paludariums, are, like I said, there's more of a defined land space, so your semi-aquatic animals and plants and terrestrial plants will not be completely in the water like some of the other methods. And like I said, they can be open or closed, but usually closed so you can display reptiles, amphibians, and things that might climb out. And this is a better example of Riparium on the bottom. So they used, I guess they're like shower trays that you would put your soap and stuff in. They suction cup to the shower, but they're full of holes so water can drain out. You can use those as planters and stick them to the back of the tank, plant your plants in it, and the plants will eventually cover it if you choose the right plants. So typically with these, what the definition is, underneath the plants is open water. You wouldn't have a wall to define the land space. So it's more marshy and wet, and like I said, they're all open top usually. So making the Riparium, I used the plant tray from ZoomEd for our auction in the fall. I found it would be better for this purpose. Inside the terrarium, I just didn't like how much room it took up in certain ways. It was a little hard to work around, but in a standard glass tank, it would be great to make a planted ledge. And because there's only the two legs on the bottom, you can easily hide that with silicone and rocks to it or something to make it a little less noticeable, but eventually, again, plants will just grow on it and hopefully you won't see it. The shower tray, like I said, they work well. One of my friends made a 15-gallon tank with one of those with, I think, pandacories and a betta she wanted to have in her dorm room. So she had ivy and pothos and things growing out the top and like a desk lamp to illuminate the tank. You can use stacked wood, rock, things like that to make more of a planted area, but again, because it's larger, looser stuff, water will flow through. So sometimes dirt builds up, and some plants don't like having their roots in water all the time, so they will just die. And like I said, the desk lamp worked well. Some of the suspended lights work well. A lot of times in reef keeping, you suspend your light above the tank. Using similar methods works fairly well. And it also allows for the plants to grow out without burning the plants from having too much light. So certain plants, if the light's too intense, you will kill the plant too. Paludariums are a little different. They require a lot more planning before you start gluing and siliconing and kind of figuring out where everything goes. I found if you can drill a tank, it makes things easier. So you can drill the bottom or the back, and that is now your set water height wherever you want it. If you're drilling from the bottom, put a standpipe, and from the back, just drill it where you want. It's good because all the water will go down into the bottom, and you can do a sump, hide all the heaters and wires and all the other stuff that you don't really want seen. There are reptile companies that are now selling kits and tanks. Zoomed and Exoterra do it. Tetra makes one, Bill, right? They still make that one tank with a drain in the bottom?
I believe so.
So they have the differences, and I'll show it in a minute. The bottom of the tank is deeper, so you can allow for more water. Sumps also add extra water, so some of these tanks, they dry out really fast. The water evaporates fast. A lot of times there's waterfalls. When you have a waterfall, you create humidity, you lose water, and in a small amount of water, you'll run out very quickly and your pump will burn out. In a sump, you can add more water. You can add an auto top off to replace water as it goes. And like I said, it just adds more water, so if you're keeping fish, things get diluted easier. And for land areas, you usually want to use a false bottom. It allows for drainage. The water will go to the bottom without sitting in the soil and adding like anaerobic areas, because if you don't do this right, if you open the tank and you disturb the soil, it's going to stink really bad. It starts to break down the organics and it smells. So false bottoms help drain out some of the water to somewhere it can collect, and you can either remove it or just leave it be. When you're making these, make sure you know where you're going to put your waterfall, plan around that. Make sure you test your pump, because some pumps are faster and it's going to create more splash like outside of your waterfall. So if you're going to put plants there, now that area is going to become a bog or soaked. So I also test pumps and all that before I start messing with gluing anything permanently in place. And acrylic or glass panels can be used to create a dry area by siliconing them in place and then filling it in with stuff. I started using expanded or PVC board, and it's like expanded so it's lightweight, and because it's PVC, it's not toxic, but it is hard to find and kind of expensive. Amazon sells it, but I think for like a 12 by 12 inch piece, it was $15. So, I mean, Home Depot sells white PVC board, but it sticks out a little too much. So the types of tanks that are common are just standard glass. The reptile tanks come either slide in front or double door type. The sliding glass ones aren't as great because you don't see the bottom, but if you're doing things like dart frogs, where you don't really necessarily want to keep fish with them, they're fine, but they usually use the sliding glass ones for venomous reptiles. So people I know who've kept like cobras and rattlesnakes, they were using those. And then the front double door is fairly common. Those are what I typically use at home. So the Paludarium kits are the ones on the top, and the one on the bottom is just standard reptile. As you can tell, the bottom section is a lot deeper. So that black bar is venting. If you put water past that, it's all going to come out the vents. They're meant to help keep the fog down on the front. They don't work. I've made them. They don't. The front still gets covered in fog and humidity every single day. I've tried wiping the glass down with stuff, like to make it cleaner. Didn't work. My friend tried using the stuff they use in scuba mask and bought the highest end, most expensive one, I think, on Amazon. It did nothing. It still, every day, gets humid and fogged up. And the only way to make that not happen is reduce humidity by increasing airflow. So sometimes you need to put a fan in or something to help circulate air. An air stone can also help with air exchange by just putting an air pump somewhere and pumping new air into the tank. But yeah, if you have a lot of water movement, you're going to get humidity, and you might want to also think about that. So some of the open top tanks are a little better. These come with screen tops. If you want to adjust the humidity, just put glass or acrylic over the top so you can increase or decrease as you let more or less air in. And also these have notch slots in the back so you can hide your wires and stuff. And if you're keeping reptiles, they won't necessarily squeeze out the top of the tank. And when you're doing all this, scale is very important. So the top ones are ones that were made in vases. So they use smaller plants, which is good, but they used gravel and it looks out of place. I would use sand and something like that, because then the scale of the sand is smaller, it looks better. The one on the right, or left bottom, that one's a lot better. The plants are all small leaf, finer carpet plant, and they use smaller substrate. In a smaller container, it looks better. And then the one on the right, they used plants that were too large. So when you use large plants in a small tank, you start to lose depth a little bit, and you focus too much on the giant plant that's right in the front. And knowing how different plants grow is good for this, because the plant may look really tiny at the store when you buy it, and then you realize this thing grows 5 or 6 feet tall, and you don't know what to do with it. And sometimes environment makes a difference. So one of my friends from school, she's a crazy houseplant person, and she likes to keep pothos. Well, in your house, they're fairly small, they don't get huge. When I plant them at my mom's house in South Florida, they will grow everywhere. So changing the environment might also change the plant. If you know what it grows like in your house, it might not grow like that inside a closed system. And some plants grow fast, so you also need to know this plant may be small and it will stay small for a while, or it's going to be small and then grow very fast very quickly. So some plants I'll use like a Nubius, even that they get large, because they grow so slow, I can replace it at a later time if I want. Or usually in my case, the tank is broken down and redone some other way by that point. So knowing how things look in the tank too also helps when determining what size tank you're going to use. So if you want to display large plants, buy a larger tank. An important part is the backgrounds in a lot of these tanks. A lot of those kits come with a insert with the tank. It's usually foam. They're okay until you start getting creatures that like to dig through it. So crabs and stuff will sometimes pull them apart, and then there's styrofoam all over your tank. I've used expanded foam. The problem with it is it doesn't stick to glass. So I silicone egg crate to the back, and it will stick to the egg crate. When you use it, it does expand a lot, so a small drop will be 4 or 5 times the size of that drop. So you don't want to fill the whole back of the tank and kind of just let it expand slowly. If you want to add more, you can add more later. And you can cover it with coconut fiber and other materials to kind of make it look a little more natural and not just like foam, but it comes out blobby kind of and lava-like. It's easy to carve too if you don't really want it somewhere, and you can embed stuff as you're going through. So you can stick driftwood and other things, flower pots in it to plant plants later up the back. And then my favorite material is the tree fern panels. It's a little bit more expensive, it's porous, it's natural, and you can just silicone it to the glass. Things can easily penetrate it and grow up the wall, so like ivies and stuff, their roots will stick to it well, and because it's a natural material, water will go through it. And things like, typically Java moss is aquatic, but if it's humid enough, you can grow it up the wall of these tree fern panels, and it'll just make like a living wall. So you can hide more wires and pipes and other things behind all of these materials. And some of them, if you want, you can also use as waterfall pieces. So the foam, if you want to do waterfall, you can kind of like make walls and stuff to make more of a channel for the water to go down. And those foam backgrounds, like if you want to use pieces even of them just to fill in places, they're painted to look natural. And the other problem too with them is a lot of reptiles like to go through the bottom and up and behind it. So sometimes like geckos will go missing and you just turn the tank around and you find them all stuck up behind there. So, and mixing all these materials is fine too. I've used cork bark even to mix with the tree fern panels to make more like a root structure or tree trunk looking kind of areas. So then when you start doing land area, the top picture is an example of someone who just glued a glass panel. It works well at keeping water on one side. The problem is you get the look of a sudden drop off in the tank. You can glue rocks or put expanded foam on to kind of make it more gradual, but over time, sometimes water does leak over into the land. So I like to put the expanded clay pellets, which ZoomEd makes, and IKEA sells them too, fairly cheap. They're a lightweight material, so you can use gravel, but gravel gets heavy after a while, and when you're using a 4 or 5 inch thick layer of it over a large area, it gets fairly heavy, and the pellets are just so much easier and lighter. And they also kind of add an extra layer of bio, like they help break down stuff because it's they're porous, so it's like a sponge. And then when
on which side, on the dry side of the panel?
Yes, because if you put these things in water, they float. When you plant on top of this, I would put a screen layer. So you put the expanded clay pellets or the rocks, then you would put window screen in, and then your substrate. So the window screen prevents the substrate from falling through and clogging up the bottom when you're watering, so all the water doesn't flush everything down into the pellets or anywhere else. And when I use soil, I either make my own with compost and some other just soil from somewhere I know doesn't have pesticides or herbicides, anything that might harm anything. I found Miracle-Gro makes an organic potting mix that I have not had an issue with yet. I've used it for like 4 or 5 years to not have any issues. I have some with some Anubias and isopods. The bugs seem fine with it. They don't die, so I think they're fine. And then there's Zilla makes a pre-made jungle mixture, which is a bunch of just random substrates mixed together, coconut fiber, tree fern bark. It doesn't say it's for plants. I tried it. It does grow plants perfectly fine. And that one is a reptile product, so you know it doesn't contain anything that would possibly kill your animals. So that's the soil mixtures that I've used. And then, like I said, when I make my own, I can use compost. I've dug soil out of the yard and used it because I knew there was nothing in it. There's recipes online. There's Dart Frog and Frog People that sell the raw materials that you can buy in bulk and then mix it all together and make different plant mixtures. Sand sometimes I mix in for some of my carnivorous plants. And with those, I would not use any of this because later I'll talk about they don't like nutrients. So knowing the plants and what kind of plants also helps with knowing what soils. The Miracle-Gro is very nutrient dense. So in my Anubias tank, once a year or so, I break down the whole tank, rinse all the soil off the plants, and replant the whole tank. It's a single Anubias plant in a 2.5 gallon tank that I started from a 3-leaf plant 8 years ago in a soda bottle. And now it's about the size of a 2.5 gallon tank, and this is after I've harvested for 8 years off of this plant. And the plant, I can take it and perfectly go straight into submersed or immersed. Either way, it's fine as long as it's humid. So the false bottom is the expanded clay pellets. You can also buy this new stuff I've seen people use. It's a coarse, dense plastic mesh like fiber. They use it for pond filters. It's porous. You can also use that as your drainage layer. And then if you glue the panel in, you have no water flow through it. If you use egg crate, you can also create more of flow through the bottom. You can allow it then to be flushed with water, and also it creates biological area for filtration. And typically in those methods, you get less smells and weird things with that. You can also put carbon mixed in to help reduce some of the odor. Terrarium people typically do that more so because carbon eventually breaks down, and if it's buried under 4 inches of soil, I'm not going and replacing that every so often. And then it just allows, again, for the water to drain away. The plant's roots won't be sitting in water. They don't rot. It just adds more like in a house plant where you don't want the plant sitting in water all day. So here's an example of the drainage layer and the fiberglass screen on top, and then you would put whatever substrate you would want on top. This was a kit that they used to sell where you can convert a 10-gallon tank standing outside by gluing in this panel and putting in a door. So you would glue this panel on the bottom, it would hinge to a door, and you could make taller tanks for reptiles. Oh, and that's the other thing. With making any of these tanks, if you're doing a closed system, tall tanks work better than short tanks. A lot of the plants will just get too tall and hit the top immediately. If you're doing open top, doesn't matter. Low or tall, it all will work. But I did a 20-gallon long, and the plants hit the top within 6 months. And then I had to just trim all the plants back or replace them because they got too large. Filtration can be tricky because the water isn't at the top of the tank. So you can't use your hang on the back filters. You can't always use a lot of the traditional fish filters. The canisters are sometimes okay. The problem with canisters in a shallow tank is trying to prime them. Trying to get the water to go up and over the edge can be a problem. I ran the ZoomEd filters fairly well in a half-filled tank, but it was a turtle filter. And that's where I found a lot of the filtration is great, is look in the turtle section of the pet store, not the fish. So Tetra makes an in-tank filter. Those work well. And again, if you have a sump, all your water would be filtered in your sump, which makes things easier. And you can also make sumps so you can use filter socks, which are great. You just take the filter sock and put it in your washer and clean them, and they're a lot easier because they're reusable. And then I've actually made filters out of PVC board and acrylic where it's just a box with a pump and the water gets pulled in and pumped back out of the box, and that works too. And again, also with the canisters is, I personally don't like canisters. I always found eventually they leak or something breaks on them, and they're a pain to find parts sometimes to fix, especially the older ones. And they take up a lot of room for not a lot of power. So I don't typically use them unless I'm doing something weird. The canister filter I ran on a Paludarium that was a river system. So I needed something that the water would get sucked in one side and pumped out the other. So that worked well for that. But when I had tree frogs, I just did the Tetra filter because it worked well. The problem with those is reptiles like to go into the back. So when I couldn't find the frogs, I usually found them in the filter hiding. And then if you're doing a waterfall, then you might want to change how you filter your tank. The Tetra filters can be used to make a waterfall. Canisters, you can pump the water to the top and allow it to flow over. Years ago, I couldn't find the kit or a picture of it, but it allowed you to glue panels into a tank and create a multi-level sectioned tank. Bill, do you remember what that was? Penplex, I think, made it. It was like panels and like trays where you can make a waterfall kind of go through multiple systems. And then there's like planted areas and like a fake background.
You got me on that? I think it was called the river tank.
Yeah, something like that. So the only thing I could find was Petco's plant tank, which I unfortunately had to maintain one of those for a while when I worked for one. That is the worst design for a tank ever because you can't access where the water goes down. So if plant leaves go down there, the whole tank backs up, and then next morning you come in, the whole floor is flooded. Or if I put fish in there, they would always end up somewhere else they shouldn't. But that kind of had the same idea where it's sectioned individually, the water would flow one to the next. It it was a great idea because you can section off different fish and house them all in one tank with fish that might not necessarily get along with each other. I mean, you run the risk of fish going into a section they shouldn't and then get eaten or something else by one of the other species. And because I couldn't find that kit anymore, I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, but I made a version out of that, out of PVC, or no, that was acrylic panels. And it did work, and I put screen between each layer to keep the fish in their section. And that had firebelly newts that crawled around between all the sections. And then Tetra also made this waterfall kit, where it's a filter and a waterfall that you would stick in your tank. It would divide the tank. The water would go up, down the back, down a stream, back into your tank. I haven't seen one of these in a while, but I think some places they still exist sometimes. And then when you have a waterfall, you can sometimes grow plants up the waterfall. So if you're making one and silicone and stuff, you can hide all the silicone with Java moss and other plants that would climb. So this is something I found works well. I put wells in some of my tanks, and it allows me to access the drainage layer without taking apart the tank. So I can flood the drainage layer by pouring water from the top down and then siphoning out all the gunk that comes out through that opening. And I found using PVC pipe with holes drilled in works well. And this also allows me to clean the tank a little bit differently. I also have hidden pumps in these wells, so if I need to access the pump ever again, it's not buried under the drainage layer. Some kits with with waterfall kits will tell you bury the pump in the expanded clay pellets and then cover it. But if the pump fails or clogs, then I'm never going to be able to access it again without tearing apart the whole tank. So I found putting things in these works well. I made one recently, and I didn't have PVC, so I used a plastic cup, and that worked too. And the only problem with these I found is sometimes animals like to hide in them, so I just put a rocker, some screen, something over the top to keep things from falling down into the hole. So plants being one of the main components, it's important. There's different types of areas that you can plant. Immersed, submersed, bog and marginal plants, epiphytes, and terrestrial plants. Each one is slightly different and different care. So your immersed plants are going to be plants that we usually use for our aquariums but are grown above water. Almost all our plants that we buy are actually grown immersed. They grow faster, they don't get algae on their leaves, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere than there would be underwater, so the plants do better. And a lot of the aquarium plants we keep in nature would actually be above water most of the year. So these plants can grow on land or underwater, and usually to do well, high humidity works. And I found when I buy these plants, buying ones that are immersed grown do better. If I buy submersed plants and try to immerse them, it doesn't always work very well. So plants that work well are Anubias, Liligia, water wisteria, cryptocorynes, sword plants. Most of these plants in nature do grow above water. Buse also does this well. And you'll notice with some plants, the leaves actually don't look the same as they would underwater. And they do grow faster. Submersed plants, typical aquarium plants. These are plants that, just aquarium, underwater. And these are plants that you would strictly find underwater more, like guppy grass, rotala, the banana plant, things that if you tried to grow them immersed, they would probably just die. Not all of these can be grown above the water. So some plants are truly aquatic. Your bog and marginal plants are typically used in ponds. People have started using them in their tanks. Irises, cattails, things like that are all bog plants. So the roots will be in the water, the leaves will be out of the water. Common house plants like bamboo, peace lilies, all of those can be grown as bog plants. You can also grow them out of water too, and they're fine. And the lucky bamboo actually isn't even a bamboo. It's a different type of plant altogether. So epiphytes are some of my favorite plants, and these are what I typically keep as houseplants in general. They're plants that grow on other plants. They're not necessarily parasitic, but they use other plants to get closer to sunlight and other ways. They don't need soil. So these are things I like to keep because I don't have the soil issue, and they're kind of a different type of plant. Most of them need humidity, and they do very well as background plants. They'll grow up the back, they'll grow up side, sticks and pieces of wood, they'll grow up. It's kind of different. So your epiphytes will be your air plants, your orchids, Spanish moss, bromeliads, and actually, when I was in Florida, I went to a botanical garden that specialized in epiphyte research. So they had a very large collection of all these plants in Florida. A lot of these are native. They just grow naturally. They're interesting, and I like the fact that things like Spanish moss makes things slightly creepy to some people as it overgrows everything. So this is a fern that is from my mom's front yard. It's kind of weird when it dries out on the tree. It looks like the picture on the right, or my right. It dries out, looks dead. As soon as you put water on it, it turns to the other picture, bright green immediately. I'm not really sure what it is. It just does this. So it either is dried up or wet. And again, this is an epiphyte, so because it doesn't have soil, it has to do weird things like this when there's no rain. So terrestrial plants are the ones most people are common with. These are plants that don't really want to be in water. So if you plant these in your tank, you're not going to want to put them near the edge of the water. They're going to rot. They're going to die. They don't usually do well. Problem with this is a lot of these are sold as aquarium plants, and if you've tried planted tanks and you didn't have luck with plants, you might have bought some of these because a lot of stores try to sell these off as aquarium plants. They last for a month or two, and then they die. And ferns, umbrella tree, ficus, those are common houseplants. They work well in terrariums, especially if you're keeping lizards. They're a little bit more robust, so when the lizards jump and climb on them, they don't kill the plant. And then the problem is, where to buy plants? Well, if you go to Home Depot and Lowe's, everything's coated in pesticides. If you buy plants from like a reptile supply or a pet store, they cost twice as much. So I found if I buy the plants from Home Depot, I take all the soil off, I rinse them off, and if it's a plant that can be kept in water, I put it in a cup of water and change the water once or twice a day for 3 to 4 weeks, and then I use it in my tank. I feel like by that point, all the pesticides that were on its roots, on its leaves, are gone. I've used them with frogs, reptiles, never had an issue. And then again, when you buy plants from a reptile supplier or a reptile expo or something, the tiny little fern is going to be $5 when the giant pot of it is maybe the same price at Lowe's. So you can not risk that problem of chemicals and pesticides by buying plants from a specialized dealer, but then you're going to pay more. There's also like nurseries and stuff, but again, they all buy their plants from the same place, so they're all going to be covered in the same material. And then also, like, now, apparently it's popular to sell houseplants through Instagram. So one of my friends does that too, and so far I've not had issues with any of the plants that she's given me. So in these tanks, you don't always keep fish. You're going to keep reptiles usually. These are the ones I've personally have had luck with and keeping without damage to the plants or the animal being in the wrong environment. Anoles are great starters. They're cheap. They're inexpensive. The equipment to keep an anole is like 8 times the cost of the actual lizard. But if it's your first time with a lizard, they're not bad. My favorite are crested geckos. They're easy. They don't eat live food. They eat paste. So if crickets bother you, crested geckos are great. They don't need UV. That's the other problem is most reptiles need UVB light. If you don't give them UVB light, they get metabolic bone disease where they can't use calcium. So when keeping reptiles, the problem is also heat, putting a heat and a light source over plants sometimes kills the plants. So when I've done tanks with reptiles, I always leave an area without plants to put a basket bulb, because if I put the bulb over a plant, it's going to burn it and kill it. So I create areas that are better for the plant and the animal. Most reptiles only eat live food, but sometimes it's a problem because crickets and things, if they're loose in the tank too long, they can bite your reptiles and they'll also eat your plants. And like me personally, I hate hearing crickets at night, so I don't like keeping those things around. I like dubia roaches better, but in a tropical environment like this, they might start to reproduce. So then you have a bunch of cockroaches crawling around. One thing I've kept a lot of over the years are turtles. Not necessarily that I wanted them, but people dumped them on me. And because I don't like my tanks looking unnatural, I've experimented with keeping plants and turtles and fish. Currently, with my red-eared sliders, I have cichlids with them in a 60-gallon tank. That seems to work fine. When I put plants in there, the turtles actually climbed up the back and ate all the plants off the back. The species on the bottom are ones I found are more plant friendly, but all turtles will just mow down things and knock everything over and eat things. So all fish and invertebrates I found with turtles are eventually going to become behavioral enrichment for the turtle. So cheap, fast fish are great. When I had my southern painted turtle in Riparium, I put giant danios in. They lasted about 3 years until the turtle got bigger and the danios got older and slower, and eventually, one by one, all 30 danios were gone in like a month. So again, when they're less than $1 each, I kind of didn't care as much than when the turtle eats the very expensive fish that it might have been living with. So the other problem is some of them are aggressive. I got a red-cheeked mud turtle from someone. I thought it would be fine. It was smaller than the other turtle. I came home one day after they were living together for 2 years, and I found the mud turtle ate the other turtle. So I found half a painted turtle in my tank. And also things like red-eared sliders. I found, again, the larger turtle for some reason got eaten by the smaller turtle. And then there's things like the terrapins, which are brackish, captive bred ones. You can keep in freshwater, but they're kind of fun because you can do a mangrove swamp instead and do mangrove trees out the top and have things like some of the native killifish, because again, they're bait, they're cheap, and if they get eaten, it's not that big of a loss. And then amphibians are your frogs, toads, salamanders. These tanks work well at displaying these kind of animals because they need the high humidity usually. And things like tree frogs are great because they'll live in the upper part of the tank while you can still have your fish and other animals at the bottom without too much interaction between the two. And the other thing is, reptiles and amphibians, you don't usually want to mix the two in the same tank. It usually causes a problem eventually. Someone's going to eat someone else, usually. Generally, amphibians are a lot easier. They don't need UVB. They don't need the heat source typically. As long as it's warm, but they don't like it usually too warm. On the cooler side is better. Most come from humid cloud forests, so higher altitude, more humidity, cooler. Dart frogs are popular, but things like tree frogs, mossy frogs, dumpy frogs, they're all more arboreal, so they'll live in the upper parts of the tank while you can still have your fish and not run into issues. But things like dumpy tree frogs, if it moves, it will be tried to shove into its mouth and be eaten. So pet stores like the one I worked at, they made me put 9 together, and over 2 months, 9 turned into 2. We did not sell them. They just ended up eating each other. One grows faster than another, and eventually someone ends up as food.
How do you feel about newts for beginners? I've never had activities before.
So newts typically eat small invertebrates that they find. I found them a little more challenging. I had the firebelly newts. Never saw the thing. I put them in my tank, and it's like going in a pleco. You see it when you put it in, you see it when it dies. Other than that, you see it when it feels like coming out. Most of the time, it looks like a bare, empty green tank. They like to hide. That's the other problem. Things like the mossy frog, I know zoos and aquariums have had problems displaying because you look in the tank and it looks like a pile of moss and people mistaken it as moss and walk on. The tank usually looks boring. Frogs are usually nocturnal. They hide under things. It looks like a bare, empty tank during the day. Dart frogs are different. They're out. But other than that, it's a bare, empty tank. So fish. I like using surface-dwelling fish, archer fish, hatchet fish, butterfly fish, things like that that are going to swim around the surface. If you're doing live plants, you don't want to do fish that like salt. So most of the archer fish like salt in their water. I wouldn't use them, but there's the clouded archer, which is only true freshwater archer fish. They work well. The only issue I've ever had with them is trying to feed them. I don't know why. I've had issues where they won't accept food, even live crickets. Mud skippers are used a lot online. They like salt in their water, plants don't. So they do better in a mangrove situation, which would work. I would not put them in a tank that is in pure fresh water. They do better with salt. There are fish that I kept a lot of over the years. When they're in fresh water, they don't live as long. And then, again, when you choose fish, you're not going to want to choose silver dollars and things like that that are going to mow down your plants underwater. Now, if you want to keep giant monster fish underneath in a very large tank and put like bog plants up top where the leaves aren't in the water, that's fine, but they might eat all the roots off the plant. So things like water hyacinth may act as a great filter until the fish or the turtle or something else decides to eat it and then make a mess of the tank and leave all the debris around, which is just going to make more nitrate. So also the live plants act as a secondary filtration. And your invertebrates, some of them, like, they're coming around more and more. Vampire crabs, they're a live-bearing freshwater crab from Indonesia. They give birth to live young that are miniature clones of the adults. They come in a red and a yellow version. They're kind of interesting, but they're still fairly expensive. They need high humidity. They do well with plants, but they're a little bit different, and they're one of the few crabs that will complete its life cycle in your tank. Isopods and springtails are used mainly as cleanup crews in these tanks. So if you have a lot of land area with a lot of plants and leaf debris and dead stuff, these animals will go, or bugs will go around and kind of break down all the organics. And in tanks like dart frog tanks, some people have made the tank bioactive, and you won't have to clean the tank until like 7 years later and actually break down the whole tank. But for several years, you don't have to do anything maintenance-wise. Certain frogs and animals, their poop is small enough, it just breaks down in the tank, and you don't actually have to clean it. So specialty tanks I've seen are orchidariums. It's a tank made to display orchids. The example, the orchid on the stick there is one my friend has. It makes a single flower once a year. But there are orchids that do better. Orchids do well in a lot of these tanks. They're great too if you're displaying fish. They stay out of the water. They grow on logs. They grow on sticks. And they're up top, so they can add some more color, more varieties of shapes and leaf textures. The small ones do well in sealed, humid containers. The larger ones that you buy at the store, they like more airflow, and the ones from the store, they sell them in a way to kill them. Those pots that they come in are not proper. They're meant to kill the plant, so you buy another one. So orchids are not actually that hard. They're easy to care for, and they make great display plants or a center plant for a tank. I keep orchids a lot, so I have a ton of these at home. Carnivorous plants are now more popular. There's pitcher plants, sundew plants, Venus flytraps. Know the plant before you buy them. There's tropical and temperate. temperate species need to be like hibernated or dormant. If you let them just continue to grow, they burn out and die. Problem with keeping them in tanks is small animals sometimes fall into things like pitcher plants and get eaten. Things as large as birds and mice have been eaten by pitcher plants, and there's plants that make pitchers that are probably about 2 or 3 feet long. And certain animals will just fall in, but there's other animals that live in them sometimes, like frogs and spiders, so those can add habitat for some of these animals. But again, they all come from nutrient-poor environments. If you use tap water to water them, the minerals in your tap water will kill the plant. Peter?
Yeah, just one thing, if anyone is interested in carnivorous plants, Monmouth County Park System in February is offering a class on how to grow them in terrarium, and you'll get your own carnivorous plant. You just have to go on the Monmouth County Park website.
And
As well, when we go to Lake Horicon to collect, there is, I think I don't know if you guys know this, but New Jersey has like 4 or 5 species of carnivorous plants, and they're all along the lake. You can see them. But it's really cool to see, when we go out there in May, June, July.
And the biggest trick with these is when people try to sell seeds from them, in 3 years they get 2 leaves. So the seeds take absolutely forever to do anything, and it's just easier to buy adult plants. And they're common now because everyone, for some reason, wants them, so they're easy to come by. So this is what I was talking about by using PVC board to make a filter. You can use PVC glue to glue it together. It sticks, it's easy to cut. I cut it with the saw on my multi-tool or score it and then snap it apart. So on one side, I made it shower so water can flow over. If you want to scale this up, I've made it into a skimmer box to sit inside a plastic cement mixing tray to act as a filter. So it was a box with a shower side. The water went in, went through a sponge, and got pumped out the back. And it just kept skimming the surface of the cement tub that had, I think it was a turtle in it. I don't actually remember. So here, I glued a pipe to the pump. The water would come up, go through filter material, and cascade over the side on the shower side of the box. And I just glued it to the back of the tank. And then I just put cork bark around it so you don't really notice it. And that's what it looked like in the tank before I put everything in. And without knowing that was there, it kind of doesn't look like anything. That piece coming down is actually a waterfall, which I forgot to mention. You can actually use cork bark cut in half, and I just sealed the inside with silicone, and it will make a waterfall. So the water goes up through the filter from the bottom, goes down the waterfall, and it doesn't look like it doesn't belong in the tank. So that was it. And this is the one I made for the auction. But once the plants are in and everything else, you don't really notice the filter box, especially as the plants will slowly grow in. But that's the tray I was talking about. In these tanks, they look a little out of place. It's kind of large. It blocks all of the light going down to the water. The fish are harder to see underneath. I would use it in a larger tank and just plant plants that are going to cascade over the side so you don't see it. And then this is one I made for North Jersey member Kathy Maraca. So this, it's kind of hard, but the front is water, and I used rocks to kind of create more of a slope into the water, and then the whole back is all live plants. Up the back and sides, I glued cork bark panel, and then there's orchids and mosses and things, and there's a waterfall with Java moss growing up it now. I'm trying to think, there's air plants, all kinds of things, and Chris, this is the shrimp where they went.
Okay, cool.
So.
I have a question, actually.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to glues, I actually just found out this year that CA glue is actually good for aquariums and good,
Mm-hmm.
and pretty much inert in water. What other types of glues are there?
I use silicone, aquarium silicone, which can be expensive, but I don't risk using the stuff from Home Depot, even that everyone on YouTube does. I can't find any Home Depot around by where I live that doesn't sell silicone that doesn't say mold-free in it, so that will kill your animals. It says 100% silicone, but it's not without additives. So I just use aquarium just to be safe. Like you said, super glue, liquid super glue is the best thing for aquariums. It's great, fresh or salt. All of the commercial super glues I've used found work the same. I like buying the stuff from Harbor Freight because it's a bunch of super glue for like $1. And that works on coral, works on plants, works on driftwood, rock, and also Kathy's new favorite one is anytime she gets a cut, because you can also use it in surgery. So it is non-toxic, it's safe, unless you glue your fingers together with it. Or in my case, I tend to drop it on the floor and step on it, and then that's a problem. So I used to use it, and I don't like it because it smells bad. Not to say silicone smells any better. So, and that's it. So.